Sega didn't have a lot of luck in the home console market in their early years. They released the SG-1000 in Japan, but it failed to compete with the Famicom. They brought the Master System over to the US, but once again, they couldn't beat Nintendo. So what about the Game Gear then? A lot of people put that in the same category as the Master System or the SG-1000, but does it deserve to be? Or did this console actually do alright? Well, let's take a look. What's going on, guys? It's Pojer coming at you with another video. We talked about the SG-1000, we talked about the Master System. I think it's only fair we talk about the Game Gear now. So if you've seen some of my content and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. We're less than 200 away from 10,000 subscribers. If everybody watching this video hits that subscribe button, we'll literally get there tomorrow. And don't forget, we have a Discord server. We just hit that 200 member mark. Just go to discord.pojer.net and I'll also leave a link in the description. Anyway, let's talk about the Game Gear.
Hey man, get portable. Get a Game Gear Supersonic Sports Pack. A color portable Game Gear, carrying case, and 2 hit games. Sonic 2, and the Majors Pro Baseball. Whoa, even save $50. The Game Gear Supersonic Sports Pack.
In the US, Sega was not having a lot of luck in the console market. The Master System, despite having superior hardware, did not perform well against the NES. Their next console, the Genesis, also had some initial failure. In both cases, the problem was not the hardware, it was Nintendo's agreement with third-party companies. Nintendo had companies like Konami, Capcom, and others on a contract that prevented them from making games on other consoles. And there's a lot of excellent third-party titles on the NES, so it was a big blow to Sega that their own consoles didn't have access to them. Sega did everything they could to bypass the lack of third-party titles, such as releasing celebrity-endorsed games and getting the license to release a few arcade classics. But doing this was not enough to compete against Nintendo. On the other hand, the NES was the best-selling console, and Nintendo's newer console, the Game Boy, was doing extremely well. Sega created the Genesis to compete with the NES, but they wanted to one-up the Game Boy as well. If Sega wanted to beat the Game Boy, they needed to address some of the flaws that the Game Boy had. The console didn't have any color, the screen was not backlit, and the hardware capabilities were limited. With this in mind, Sega would prioritize making sure the upcoming console would be in color, have a backlit screen, and be technologically superior to the Game Boy. But Sega was really behind in the handheld console market. The Game Boy and Atari Lynx had already been out for at least a year, so Sega needed to produce this console quickly. To save time, the hardware was based off the Master System with some upgrades. Since the Master System was a failure in the US, perhaps recycling the hardware for a potentially successful follow-up isn't such a bad idea. Using Master System hardware was also nice because it would be easy to port games from that console over to this new one. They also sought to make the console look like a Genesis controller with rounded corners so that it was comfortable to hold. In April of 1991, the Game Gear was released in the US. Following Nintendo's footsteps, they bundled the Game Gear with columns. Nintendo had a lot of success after making Tetris the pack-in title for the Game Boy, so Sega followed suit. As expected, the Game Gear one-upped the Game Boy in terms of hardware in most aspects. The Game Gear had 8 kilobytes of general purpose RAM and 16 kilobytes of video RAM. The Game Boy, in comparison, had 8 kilobytes of general RAM as well, but only contained half as much video RAM. To be fair though, some games did have external RAM. The Game Gear was based on Master System hardware with a big upgrade to the color palette from 64 colors to 4096 colors. Wow, that's a big improvement over the Game Boy, which only supported 4 grayscale colors. Because the hardware is similar, there would be an add-on for the Game Gear that would allow you to play Master System games on it. However, we would never get an add-on to play Game Gear titles on a home console because the color palette was too high for both the Master System and, shockingly, the Genesis. With these new hardware advantages, what does this all look like? Well, let's take a look at a few games. First, we'll take a look at Fantasy Zone. I thought this would be a port of the Master System version, but it's actually a whole new game. It's a Defender clone where you have to shoot down all the enemy bases and then fight a boss at the end. You can access a store where you can purchase upgrades. This title really showcases the Game Gear's large color palette, and it looks great. The only issue I have is the janky camera. The camera is rarely ever positioned correctly, making it harder to see what's in front of you. There's also no status bar showing you how many enemy bases are left, which is really unlike Fantasy Zone. Also, when you purchase items from the store, the game doesn't automatically equip you with them. You have to manually select them. Why not just automatically give me the upgrades after I purchase them? That's how the other Fantasy Zone games work. But overall, this is a great game, and I'm glad we got this new one instead of the Master System version. Now let's try Shinobi. Like with Fantasy Zone, I thought they would just port the Master System version, but they actually gave us something different here. It actually looks more like Revenge of Shinobi, which is a big compliment. Graphically, the game looks fantastic with multiple layers of scrolling. Unlike the original Shinobi, where you're jumping between different background layers, here it's more like a basic platformer and it plays really well. I had a lot of fun with this one, and I'm impressed that they mimicked the Genesis version rather than bringing over the Master System one. Let's try Road Rash. I had the Genesis one as a kid and I loved it, so I'm honestly amazed at how well the Game Gear version turned out. It almost looks exactly like the Genesis version. I'm really impressed. Now, the Game Gear was in a weird position because the hardware is essentially a generation behind, so it's amazing to see that this unit was mimicking games from the 90s. If you want your console to stand out from Nintendo, these are the type of games that you need. Now for NBA Jam. The presentation here is excellent. Even though the Game Gear is essentially a Master System, the game looks more like the Genesis or Super Nintendo version. If you wanted to play this game on the go back then, this was definitely your best option by far. Now let's try Sonic Triple Trouble. The premise is that Dr. Robotnik stole the Chaos Emeralds and Knuckles has been tricked into helping him. You can choose either Sonic or Tails, and it plays a lot like the Genesis titles. Graphically, it looks fantastic, and it's actually very fast-paced for a Sonic Game Gear title. The music is also excellent. This is one of the few Sonic games on the platform that was not a Master System port, and in my opinion, it's the best one. Later on, we would get Sonic Blast. Here you can play as Sonic or Knuckles, which is nice, and the graphics are fantastic here. This title really showcases what the Game Gear can really do, and the music is also fantastic. But unfortunately, there's some big problems with this one. Your character is so large and the game is so zoomed in, it's hard to tell what's in front of you. You also move very slow in this game. They focused way too much on the graphics and not enough on the gameplay. It's playable, but this is a big departure from Sonic Triple Trouble. Sega would try to market the Game Gear as the cool, more mature option, while the Game Boy was for kids. Their commercials would attack Nintendo in every way imaginable, even claiming that only a dog wouldn't notice the advantages of the Game Gear over the Game Boy. These type of advertisements were also done for the Genesis. In the early years of the Game Gear, Sega encountered the same problem as their previous consoles: lack of third-party support. Once again, the superior hardware didn't stand a chance against Nintendo because of the game lineup. However, Sega would finally get a big break. A little backstory: with the release of the Genesis, some third-party developers who had never developed NES games, namely EA and Accolade, had decided to join Sega rather than Nintendo. Unlike Nintendo, Sega was way more lenient with third-party developers, which might have enticed some developers to join Team Sega. With Sega being more lenient, Nintendo would follow suit and also relax their policies, including the exclusivity clause. So for the first time, Sega was getting the third-party support that they desperately needed. This helped the Genesis tremendously, as it would finally receive some excellent titles from third-party developers, and it would give a boost to the Game Gear as well. This meant that we would start seeing some familiar Game Gear titles, and this would also mean that the game lineup would be better. So far, it seems like Sega is finally having some luck with the Game Gear, but there were some issues with it. The more powerful hardware, the backlit screen, and large color palette were all nice things, but it came at a huge cost. The battery life was atrocious. It took 6 AA batteries and the console only lasted 3 to 5 hours. This is a big disadvantage over the Game Boy, which only required 4 AA batteries and lasted up to 30 hours. For a portable console, the battery life is very important. Imagine going on a trip and only having 3 to 5 hours to play. The screen quality was also very poor. It was hard to see the game, and you would have to move the console in different positions to see it. But the backlit screen was still a big advantage over the Game Boy. I really wish that Sega made a revision to the Game Gear with better screen quality and longer battery life like Nintendo did. The game lineup, while better than the Master System, was still pale in comparison to the Game Boy. The Game Gear had around 300 titles during its lifespan, while the Game Boy had 1,000. Even with better third-party support in its later years, the game lineup was still not as good. Overall, the console sold a respectable 11 million units worldwide, but that's far less than the Game Boy, who sold 119 million units. Once again, better hardware was not enough to take down Nintendo. But unlike the Master System, which did not perform well in the US, the Game Gear did outsell the Atari Lynx, which was another portable console. While it didn't beat the Game Boy, the console was not a complete failure either. In an attempt to beat Nintendo, Sega released their own handheld console that addressed the flaws of the Game Boy. The Game Gear was essentially a handheld Master System with a better color palette, backlit screen, and some decent games to go along with it. But the Game Boy had a longer battery life and a much better library of games. Despite that though, the Game Gear still performed alright, and it did receive some third-party support later on. If the Master System got that same support, maybe the outcome of that console would have been different. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.